It all started in 1847. The wind howled across the endless plains, carrying the scent of blood and burning wood. Florence stumbled through the knee-high grass, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The rifle she clutched was too heavy for her aching arms, slick with sweat and dirt. Behind her, the remains of her family's homestead smoldered in the moonlight, a beacon for the men who hunted her. She hadn't seen their faces clearly, just flashes, grinning teeth beneath wide-brimmed hats, the gleam of steel in the firelight, her mother's scream vanishing into the night. She ran because there was nothing else to do, because stopping meant dying. A sharp crack split the air, a rifle shot. The bullet whistled past her, biting into the earth near her feet. Panic surged through her chest. She veered toward the tree line, toward the deeper wilds where no settler dared go. The land stretched dark and untamed before her, a jagged maze of rock and bramble. She forced herself forward, her body threatening to collapse with every step. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed, but she didn't stop until the sounds of pursuit faded into the wind. She collapsed near a dry creek bed, pressing herself against the cool earth. The night air carried unfamiliar sounds, distant hoots of owls, the rustling of unseen creatures. But beneath it all was something else, something deeper. A whisper almost drifting on the wind. Florence swallowed hard, gripping the rifle as she scanned the darkness. Her mother had told her stories about these lands, about the spirits that walked here. She'd never believed them, but as she sat there, alone in the vast and pulsing night, she began to wonder. A twig snapped. She spun, raising the rifle. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her. Moonlight glinted off his bronze skin, the high edges of his cheekbones casting long shadows. He was tall, his dark hair woven with eagle feathers, his stance unshaken. His eyes, deep and unreadable, held no fear. Florence's fingers tensed on the trigger. He made no move for a weapon, only studied her as if weighing something unseen. "You are lost." His voice was low, steady. She swallowed, trying to keep the tremor from her own. They killed my family." He didn't react. No surprise, no sympathy. Just silence, deep as the night. Then he turned. She hesitated. Her body ached for rest, for shelter. But she had no reason to trust him, no reason to follow. Yet, when he walked away, she found herself rising, her legs moving on their own. He led her through the wilderness, past towering rock formations and silent, ancient trees. The air felt different here, heavier, alive. The further they walked, the more she felt a presence in the land itself, something vast and watching. At last, they arrived at a hidden encampment nestled between the cliffs. Firelight flickered on the faces of people who turned to watch them with guarded expressions. Florence felt their eyes on her, curious, wary. The man spoke to an older woman wrapped in thick furs. She regarded Florence for a long moment before nodding. The man turned back to her. "My name is Angino," he said. "You may stay until you are strong enough to leave." It was not kindness, just a statement. She nodded anyway. Inside the tent they gave her, she curled up on a thick hide, exhaustion dragging her under. But before sleep claimed her, she thought she heard something outside, whispers in a language she didn't understand. A voice, low and ancient, rustling like the wind through leaves. She dreamt of fire and smoke, and somewhere, beyond the flames, a shadow watching her. Florence's body ached with every movement, her muscles stiff from days of exertion. But Agnino did not relent. He moved through the forest like a spirit, his footfalls silent, his presence an extension of the land itself. She struggled to match his pace, her boots catching on roots and uneven ground, her breath harsh in her ears. Again, he commanded, his voice firm but absent of cruelty. She adjusted the grip on her bow, her fingers raw from the string's bite. The arrow trembled as she drew it back, her shoulders tight, her focus fraying. She released too early. The shot went wide, embedding itself in the dirt instead of the crude wooden target. Agnino exhaled, neither pleased nor disappointed, only watchful. "You hesitate," he said. "Out here, hesitation is death." Florence gritted her teeth, frustration mounting. "I wasn't raised to fight like this." "No," he agreed, taking a step closer. "But you were not raised to survive, either." His words stung more than she wanted to admit. She had lived on the edge of the wild, had seen hardship, but none of it had prepared her for the lawless brutality of the frontier. The world had taken everything from her, and she had barely escaped with her life. Añino saw it in her. Her fear, her fury, her desperation to prove she was not just another lost soul waiting to be buried in the dust. He handed her another arrow. She took it, steadied her breath, and tried again. This time, the arrow flew straight, striking the target's outer ring. Not perfect, but better. Añino gave a slight nod, an acknowledgement without praise. Enough for today. The others still watched her with wary eyes. She could feel their judgment, the unspoken question of why a white girl was allowed to stay among them. Some whispered that she was an omen, a bad spirit that had stumbled into their lives. Others saw only trouble, the kind that drew men with guns and greed. She understood their mistrust. That night, she sat near the fire, wrapping her fingers around a clay bowl of stew, the warmth seeping into her bones. Across the circle, White Owl, the old woman who had first looked upon her with such deep, knowing eyes, murmured softly to Añino in their tongue. Florence didn't need to understand the words to know she was the subject of discussion. Añino turned to her. "The elders wish to know your plans." She stiffened. "I don't have any." "Then make some," he said simply. She thought about it. She had nowhere to go, no family left, no home to return to. The only thing she had was her name and the rifle that had failed to save the people she loved. "I want to stay." The words left her lips before she could second-guess them. Añino held her gaze, measuring something in her. The firelight flickered in his dark eyes, casting shadows that made him seem older, wearier. "You will need more than that," he said. Before she could ask what he meant, the distant sound of hoofbeats shattered the quiet. A rider galloped into the village, his horse lathered in sweat. He slid from the saddle, breathless, his face grim. "They're coming." Silence fell, then movement quick and sure. The warriors rose, grabbing weapons, exchanging hushed words. The women ushered the children toward the deeper shadows of the camp. Añino stood. "How many?" 10, maybe more. They followed the girl's tracks. Florence's blood ran cold. Añino turned to her. "You bring death to my people." She swallowed hard, the weight of guilt pressing against her ribs. "I didn't." His expression darkened. "It does not matter. The outlaws would be here soon." Men like Elias Crow did not leave loose ends, and she was the last piece of a story they wanted buried. She had seen their faces. She had survived. That alone was enough for them to hunt her down. Añino grabbed his war club, his expression unreadable. "You wish to stay?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "Then fight." The minutes stretched thin as they prepared. The warriors fanned out, bows and rifles ready. Florence's hands shook as she loaded her weapon. She had never killed a man before, had never wanted to, but survival was no longer a question of want. The first shot rang out, breaking the night. Chaos followed. The air filled with the sharp crack of gunfire, the thud of arrows finding flesh, the screams of the wounded. Florence pressed herself against the rocks, aiming into the darkness, her heart pounding against her ribs. A figure loomed ahead, the glint of steel catching the firelight. She fired. The rifle kicked back against her shoulder, the force nearly knocking her over. The man crumpled, a choked gurgle escaping his lips before he stilled. Florence gasped, her hands shaking. There was no time to think. Another man rushed toward her, blade raised. Before she could react, Añino appeared, striking with brutal efficiency, his war club connecting with the outlaw's skull. The battle raged, but the outlaws had not expected resistance. They fell back, their numbers dwindling. As quickly as it had begun, it was over. The few who remained alive vanished into the night, their pursuit abandoned. The village was left in smoldering ruin. Bodies lay sprawled in the dirt, blood soaking into the earth. Among them were not only outlaws, but Añino's own people. He stood in the center of the carnage, his expression unreadable. His hands, stained with blood, clenched at his sides. Florence knew then that there was no going back. She had drawn death to this place, and now she owed it her life. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of fire and something older, something deeper. Onyino turned to her, his voice heavy with meaning. This is only the beginning. The survivors moved swiftly through the wild, their presence swallowed by the vast emptiness of the land. The wind carried the scent of blood and gunpowder, the memory of battle lingering in the cool night air. Onyino led the way, his movements deliberate, each step chosen with the precision of a man who understood the language of the earth. Florence followed, her legs aching, her body still trembling from the violence that had torn through the village. She had killed a man. The weight of it sat heavy in her chest, an iron stone pressing against her ribs. She had fired, he had fallen, and the world had continued on as if nothing had changed. Except everything had. The deeper they traveled, the more the land shifted. The rolling plains gave way to jagged rock formations, the trees thinning into skeletal remains of ancient giants. The moon cast silver light over the terrain, illuminating narrow paths that wove through the towering cliffs. A place untouched by time. Angino's people called it Ghost Rock Canyon, a land whispered about in stories, a place where spirits still walked among the living. The others did not question why they had come here. Perhaps they too felt the pull of something unseen, the presence that seemed to hum beneath the earth. They made camp beneath an overhanging ledge, the fire burning low to avoid drawing unwanted eyes. Florence sat with her back against the rock, staring into the flames, her fingers curled around the rifle in her lap. The blood had dried on her hands, but she still felt it there, staining her skin. "You carry ghosts now," Onyino said. She looked up. He sat across from her, his expression unreadable, his face cast in shifting shadows. "I didn't have a choice." The words felt weak, like an excuse that had already withered in her throat. Onyino studied her. "No, you did not." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of burning wood and the distant cry of some unseen creature. Florence swallowed. "Do you see them?" His gaze did not waver. "The dead." She nodded. He exhaled slowly, the fire reflecting in his dark eyes. "I see many things." Florence shivered. The air felt heavier here, thicker, as if something unseen pressed against her skin. She had never believed in spirits, but in this place, in this moment, she wasn't so sure. Onyino reached into the small pouch at his side, retrieving a bundle of dried sage. He tossed it into the fire, and immediately the scent filled the air, earthy, sharp, cleansing. "The spirit road is not walked by the dead alone," he murmured. Florence didn't ask what he meant. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. Sleep did not come easily that night. When she finally drifted into the embrace of exhaustion, the dreams came. She was standing in the ruins of her family's homestead, the air thick with smoke. The bodies lay where they had fallen, their faces obscured by shadow. She turned, and there, just beyond the flames, stood a figure. Onyino, but not as he was. His face was painted in stark white, his body adorned with feathers and beads, his eyes glowing like embers. Behind him, others stood, figures lost to time, their forms shifting like mist in the firelight. He lifted a hand, beckoning. She stepped forward, drawn by some unseen force, but as soon as she moved, the ground beneath her feet crumbled away. She fell. Florence woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fire had burned low, casting only faint light across the camp. Onyino sat where he had before, awake, unmoving, watching. "You saw them," he said. She swallowed hard, her skin damp with sweat. "I don't," she stopped. Lying felt useless. "What does it mean?" Angino's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the first traces of dawn painted the sky in muted gold. "The spirits do not come without reason." She thought of her mother's journal, the pages filled with strange markings, symbols she had never understood. She thought of the symbol she had found etched into the canyon wall, the same one from the worn leather pages. A memory surfaced unbidden. Her mother, sitting by the window at dusk, fingers tracing those same symbols into the wooden table. A distant look in her eyes. "We were never meant to stay here," she had whispered once when she thought Florence wasn't listening. The land remembers. Florence hadn't understood then. But now, as she sat in the heart of a place where the past bled into the present, she wondered if her mother had always known something she hadn't. Agnino rose, his movement fluid, deliberate. "Come." She hesitated only a moment before pushing herself up, following him deeper into the canyon. The path twisted, narrowing as the towering rock walls closed in around them. The morning light cast long shadows, making the land feel both ancient and alive. They stopped before a large stone, its surface weathered by time. Carved into it was the same symbol from her mother's journal, a spiral, curling inward, surrounded by lines that resembled flowing water. She reached out, fingers brushing against the grooves. The stone was warm beneath her touch. Agnino watched her closely. "You have always belonged to this place," he said, his voice quiet. Florence looked at him, searching his face for something, anything that would make sense of the storm inside her. "Why?" His expression did not change. "Because the land does not forget." The wind stirred around them, carrying whispers she could not quite understand. A shiver ran down her spine, but she did not pull away. For the first time since she had lost everything, she felt something she could not name. Not fear, not grief. Something older, something waiting. Agnino turned, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "They will come again." Florence tightened her grip on the rifle, her pulse steady now. "Then we will be ready." The wind carried their words into the open sky, lost among the echoes of those who had walked this land long before them. The sun bled into the horizon, casting Ghost Rock Canyon in molten hues of red and gold. The wind carried dust and whispers, the echoes of lives long past. Florence crouched on the ridge, her breath steady, her fingers curled around the stock of her rifle. Below, the outlaws were coming. Elias Crow rode at the front, his long coat billowing behind him like a shadow. His men followed, a dozen strong, their horses kicking up dust as they wove through the narrow pass. They moved with the arrogance of men who had never been beaten, who had left only ruin in their wake. Agnino stood beside Florence, silent, watching. He held his war club loosely in one hand, the other resting against the earth as if listening to its breath. His people had fought and bled for this land. Now, they would fight again. "They do not expect resistance," he murmured. Florence exhaled. "Then let's surprise them." The canyon had been prepared. Every rock, every path had been chosen with purpose. They had no numbers, no firepower to match the outlaws, but they had the land. The land remembered. The first shot rang out, cracking through the canyon like a splintering bone. Florence saw one of Crow's men jerk back in his saddle, toppling to the ground before the echo faded. Then came the chaos. Arrows whistled from the shadows, finding flesh before the outlaws could react. Gunfire erupted, bullets sparking off the canyon walls as Crow's men scrambled for cover. The horses screamed, rearing in panic, their riders cursing as they fought for control. Florence moved swiftly, shifting positions between the rocks. She raised her rifle, lining up her shot. Another outlaw fell, his body crumpling into the dust. She didn't think about it, didn't let herself hesitate. This was survival. Crow bellowed orders, his voice sharp as a whip. He turned his gaze upward, searching for the source of the ambush. His eyes locked on Florence. Recognition flickered, followed by something else, something colder. "Come out, girl," he called, his voice carrying over the gunfire. "You think hiding will save you?" Florence's hands tightened on the rifle. Her heart pounded, but she did not answer. Agnino slipped away into the shadows, vanishing between the rocks. This was the plan. They would draw Crow's men deeper, make them fight a battle they didn't understand. The outlaws regrouped, their gunfire less frantic now, more controlled. They pressed forward, using the canyon walls for cover, forcing Florence and the others back. A figure moved in the periphery of her vision. She turned, too late. A hand clamped onto her wrist, wrenching her forward. She barely caught a glimpse of the outlaw before he knocked the rifle from her grip, sending it clattering to the ground. She twisted, bringing up her elbow, striking hard. The man grunted, but didn't release her. His other hand closed around her throat. Florence gasped, her vision tilting, dark spots dancing at the edges. Then the pressure vanished. The outlaw stumbled back, a war club buried deep in his chest. Agnino pulled it free in one swift motion, his face unreadable. The man gurgled once, then fell. Florence sucked in air, her pulse hammering. Agnino met her gaze. No hesitation, he reminded her. She nodded, swallowing the shaking in her limbs. There was no time for weakness. Crow's men pushed forward, but the canyon did not welcome them. The path narrowed ahead, forcing them into a bottleneck. Agnino's warriors waited. As the outlaws rushed in, the earth seemed to shift beneath them. A hidden pit gave way, sending two men plunging into the depths below. Others stumbled, their footing unsteady on the loose rocks. Florence retrieved her rifle, steadying her aim. She fired, and another outlaw fell. Crow, still on horseback, snarled in frustration. He spurred his horse forward, charging through the chaos. His gun barked, sending a bullet tearing through the air. Florence barely ducked in time. The shot splintered the rock beside her. She turned, leveling her rifle, but Crow was already moving. He rode hard straight for her. She dove aside as the horse thundered past. Crow wheeled back, his gun raised. Then the ground shifted. The earth cracked beneath his horse's hooves, a sinkhole opening where the canyon had been weakened. The animal screamed, rearing, but it was too late. Crow tumbled from the saddle, hitting the ground hard. His horse plunged into the chasm, swallowed by dust and darkness. Florence pushed herself to her feet, rifle in hand. Crow groaned, rolling onto his side. His hat had fallen away, his face streaked with dirt and blood. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating. He reached for his gun. Florence aimed. "Don't!" He paused, his fingers curling over the handle. A smirk tugged at his lips. "You got grit, girl," he murmured. "Didn't think you had it in you." Her hands didn't shake. "Not this time." "You killed my family," she said, her voice steady. "You came for me." Crow exhaled, tilting his head. "Ain't personal. Just the way the world works." Her finger tightened on the trigger. Agnino's voice cut through the moment. "The land will take him." Florence hesitated. The wind stirred, carrying whispers she could not quite understand. Crow shifted, sensing the moment of indecision. His smirk widened. "That's right, girl. You ain't a killer." But the land remembered. The canyon that had been their refuge, their battlefield, had already decided. The ground beneath Crow's broken body crumbled. His smirk vanished as he slid, grasping at the loose earth, but there was nothing to hold on to. He disappeared into the chasm. The dust settled. The battle was over. The warriors emerged from the shadows, their expressions solemn. The price had been paid in blood, but the land was still theirs. Agnino stood beside Florence, silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. "The spirit road does not end here." She knew he was right. This was only the beginning. The dawn rose over Ghost Rock Canyon, bathing the land in gold. The wind carried away the last echoes of battle, leaving only silence. Florence turned, her mother's journal still tucked in her belt, her rifle slung across her back. The land did not forget, and neither would she. The wind howled like a wounded beast, tearing through the pine trees with a fury that sent snow swirling in every direction. The sky, a heavy, slate-gray mass, hung low over the endless stretch of wilderness, suffocating any hint of warmth. Abigail Johnson pressed forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps, each exhale crystallizing in the frigid air. Her horse had bolted an hour ago, spooked by the storm's sudden violence, leaving her stranded miles from Cold Creek. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little against the biting wind. Her boots sank deep into the snow, each step an effort against the weight dragging her down. The town's trading post had been a necessity. Her provisions had run low, and she hadn't expected the storm to roll in so quickly. Now, The landscape had transformed into a white abyss, swallowing the familiar landmarks she relied on. She had to keep moving, stopping mid-death. Her fingers, numbed past pain, clutched the small bundle of supplies she had managed to retrieve when her saddlebags spilled into the snow. The cold gnawed at her mercilessly, burrowing deep into her bones. Panic clawed at the edges of her mind, whispering that she would never make it home, that this was how it would end, alone, lost in the endless white. A jagged gust slammed into her, stealing what little warmth remained in her body. Her knees buckled. She collapsed, the snow embracing her like a cold lover, pulling her into its depths. The exhaustion was overwhelming, seeping into her limbs, dulling the edges of her fear. Perhaps if she just rested for a moment. A sound cut through the wind, a sharp, rhythmic crunch. Footsteps, heavy boots pressing through the ice-crusted snow. It was impossible. She must be imagining it. Then came the voice, rough-edged and low, barely audible over the storm. "Don't sleep." A gloved hand grabbed her arm, pulling her upright with surprising strength. She gasped as she was lifted, her body too weak to resist. Her vision blurred, the world shifting between white and dark as she struggled to focus on the figure beside her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his coat dusted with snow, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat pulled low against the wind. "Can you walk?" His voice was steady, but not unkind. She tried to speak, but her throat felt lined with ice. Instead, she nodded weakly, though her legs barely held her weight. Without another word, he scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and began moving through the storm. Abigail fought the darkness creeping at the edges of her vision, her head lolling against the man's chest. His coat smelled of pine and wood smoke, the scent oddly grounding. She wanted to ask his name, to demand to know where he was taking her, but the words wouldn't come. By the time they reached shelter, she was slipping in and out of awareness. A door creaked open, the warmth inside hitting her like a wave, making her shiver violently. The man carried her over the threshold and set her down on something solid, a bed, perhaps, before kneeling to unlace her boots. She tried to protest, but her limbs refused to cooperate. "You'll lose your toes if these stay on," he muttered, tugging them free. Frostbite sets in fast. A fire crackled nearby, its golden glow flickering against the rough-hewn walls. Abigail's breath stuttered as the warmth seeped into her frozen skin, sending sharp pains through her fingers and toes. She winced, curling inward as she tried to regain control of her own body. The man disappeared for a moment, then returned with a rough, woolen blanket, draping it over her. She could feel the weight of his gaze, assessing, waiting. "You alone?" His question was simple, but it carried an undercurrent of something else, caution perhaps. She managed a nod. "You got family in town?" Again, she nodded, though that was only half true. Since her husband's death, she had lived on the outskirts, tending to the small plot of land they had settled together. Cold Creek tolerated her presence, but she had never truly belonged. The man grunted, as if satisfied with the answer. "Storm's going to be bad through the night. You'll stay here." Abigail forced herself to look at him, her vision finally clearing enough to take in his features. He was rugged, his face lined with the kind of wear that came from years of hardship. Dark stubble shadowed his jaw, and his eyes, hard and unreadable, were the color of storm-touched earth. "Who are you?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Arthur Mason," he said, pulling a chair closer to the fire and sitting down. He didn't offer anything more. She had heard the name before, spoken in hushed tones around town. A man with a past no one cared to elaborate on. A man people crossed the street to avoid. Fear tightened in her chest, warring with the gratitude she knew she owed him. He had saved her life, but at what cost? As if sensing her unease, Arthur leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I don't mean you harm, Mrs. Johnson," she supplied, her voice steadier now. "Abigail Johnson." He nodded slowly. "Rest, Abigail Johnson. You'll need your strength." She should have stayed awake, should have demanded more answers, but exhaustion dragged her down like a weight too heavy to fight. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Arthur Mason, watching the fire, his expression unreadable. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, for the first time in hours, she felt something close to safe. By the time Abigail could ride again, the snow had begun to recede in the valleys, though the cold still clung stubbornly to the air. Arthur had offered her his horse without argument, walking beside her in silence as they made their way back to Cold Creek. The town's silhouette rose in the distance, dark shapes against a sky the color of tarnished silver. She had expected relief at the sight of home, but unease curled in her stomach instead. Cold Creek was not a forgiving place. The people here whispered as readily as they prayed, their judgments swift and lasting. She could already hear the questions, see the narrowed eyes behind lace curtains. A widow disappearing for days, only to return in the company of Arthur Mason, was enough to set tongues wagging for years. They reached the main road, their arrival drawing the first sets of eyes from the storefronts. Abigail squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of their gazes. She slid off the horse, her legs still weak beneath her, but Arthur made no move to help her. He knew, just as she did, that any act of kindness between them would only fuel speculation. The silence of the street was unnatural. Even in the depths of winter, Cold Creek was never truly still. Now, however, the town seemed to hold its breath, waiting. It was Mrs. Calloway who spoke first, her sharp voice slicing through the quiet. Abigail Johnson. She called from the steps of the mercantile, her eyes hard with barely concealed disapproval. We feared the worst when you didn't return from the trading post. And yet, here you are, in the company of— She paused, her lips pursing as she cast a glance at Arthur. Him. Arthur didn't flinch, but Abigail saw the tension settle in his shoulders. He kept his face impassive, unreadable. He had endured this before. I was caught in the storm, Abigail said, keeping her voice measured. My horse ran off. Arthur Mason found me half dead in the snow and brought me to shelter. There was no outright accusation in Mrs. Calloway's expression, but it lingered in the press of her lips, the tightness in her features. Shelter, she echoed, the word thick with implication. Pastor Edmonds stepped forward then, his hands clasped before him. The Lord tests us in many ways, he said, his voice carrying the authority of the pulpit. You have been through an ordeal, Abigail. But our town is built on virtue, on the strength of our good name. A woman living alone must be careful with such things. The meaning was clear. She should not have gone with him. Even if dying in the snow had been her alternative, Cold Creek would have preferred that ending. She didn't have a choice, Arthur said, his voice as flat as iron. I found her near frozen. She wouldn't have made it through the night. There was no gratitude in their eyes, no nods of understanding. To them, his presence alone made the act suspect. Arthur Mason had always been an outsider, a shadow on the edge of town, a man with a past that Cold Creek refused to forget. Ezra Calloway stepped onto the porch, arms crossed over his chest. His gaze flicked between Abigail and Arthur, his mouth curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. People will talk, he said, feigning concern. A woman in your position, well, you understand, your reputation matters, Abigail. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold worked its way through her spine. She knew what this was. It wasn't about her honor. It was about control. She had held on her late husband's land, despite Ezra's persistent interest in buying it. Now, they saw an opportunity to force her hand. She could set things right, Mrs. Calloway said, glancing at the pastor. A woman's virtue can be restored through the sanctity of marriage. The words fell heavy between them, and Abigail felt the walls closing in. You want me to marry him, she said, disbelief thick in her voice. It would be the proper thing to do, the pastor replied, his expression solemn. A way to silence gossip, to protect your standing. She turned to Arthur then, expecting resistance, anger or something. But his face remained unreadable, his dark eyes locked onto the crowd. He understood as well as she did. Cold Creek was not offering a choice. They were issuing a sentence. Arthur exhaled slowly. You're forcing this on her? The pastor's expression remained calm. No one is forcing anything, he said. But there are expectations. Abigail swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth. If she refused, she would become a pariah. She would be shunned in the stores, denied work, treated as a woman of ruined reputation. Her land would become a target. Cold Creek would ensure she had no means to survive on her own. Arthur Mason was an outcast, but he was still a man. And a man, no matter how disgraced, would always have more power than a woman standing alone. The silence stretched long enough for her heartbeat to thunder in her ears. Then, finally, she lifted her chin. "If it must be done," she said, the words tasting like iron, "then let's be done with it." There was no joy in their faces, only satisfaction. The wedding was held the next morning, beneath the wooden beams of the town's small church. The air inside was colder than the wind outside, the ceremony stripped of any warmth or celebration. Pastor Edmund spoke the vows in a steady, emotionless voice, and Abigail recited the words with a numbness she had never known before. Arthur stood beside her, solid as stone, his expression carved from the same material. He did not reach for her hand. He did not look at her when the words were spoken, when the binding was sealed. It was over in minutes. They walked out of the church together, bound by law, by expectation, by a future neither had chosen. The town watched them go, their judgment still heavy in the air. Cold Creek had gotten what it wanted. Arthur helped her onto his horse without a word, then swung up behind her. They rode in silence, away from the watchful eyes of Cold Creek, toward the small, isolated cabin where her life had changed only days before. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and slow. A storm of a different kind had only just begun. The wind screamed through the trees, carrying with it the weight of something unseen but closing in fast. Abigail felt it in her bones long before the first sign of danger arrived. The unnatural stillness of the forest, the way even the birds had stopped their restless chatter, the distant crunch of boots on frozen ground where no man should be. She set the pot down from where she had been boiling snow for water, wiping her hands against her skirt. Arthur was outside, splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady drumbeat against the hush of the wilderness. Their life together was one of necessity, not warmth. The town had cast them out as soon as the wedding vows had been uttered, and Abigail had gone with him because there had been no choice. She worked the cabin the way she had worked her old home, but there was no comfort in these walls. She stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. Arthur was still working, his broad frame moving fluidly as he swung the axe, splitting another log clean down the middle. He hadn't looked at her since they had arrived back at the cabin. He hadn't spoken much either. Something about the air sent a ripple of unease through her. Arthur must have sensed it too, because he stilled mid-swing, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward the tree line. His hand shifted, his grip on the axe tightening. A rider crested the ridge, a dark silhouette against the stark white of the snow. Another followed, then a third. Abigail's stomach turned to stone. Arthur dropped the axe, his movements measured as he stepped toward the porch. "Get inside," he said, his voice low, calm in a way that set her pulse racing. She didn't argue. The cabin door shut behind her, and she moved quickly, her fingers fumbling as she reached for the rifle propped against the wall. She checked the chamber the way her father had taught her long ago. Outside, hooves crunched against snow. She moved to the window, pressing against the wooden frame, her breath fogging the glass. The riders had stopped just beyond the clearing. One of them, a man with a scarred face and a thick wool coat, nudged his horse forward. "Arthur Mason," he called, his voice carrying through the cold. "Been a long time?" Arthur stood with his hands at his sides, close enough to his gun, but not yet reaching for it. "Not long enough." The man grinned, though there was nothing friendly in it. "You got something belongs to me." Arthur's jaw ticked. "Ain't got a thing that's yours, Dawson." Abigail inhaled sharply. Dawson. The name clanged against her memory, dredging up stories whispered in town, stories she had not understood then. The Dawson gang had been the scourge of Cold Creek once, until Arthur Mason had killed their leader. And now they had come to settle that debt. The scarred man tilted his head. "That's so. 'Cause I heard different. I heard you got yourself a nice little homestead out here. A wife. That right?" Arthur didn't answer. The man's smile widened. I figure we'll take that from you too. Arthur moved then, so fast that Abigail barely saw it. His hand snapped to his holster, and the first shot cracked through the clearing. The man jerked backward, his body twisting in the saddle before he hit the snow. Then the others drew their guns. The world erupted into fire and thunder. Arthur dove for cover behind the woodpile as bullets splintered the porch railing. Abigail yanked the door open and raised the rifle, bracing against the recoil as she fired at the second man. He cursed, ducking low in his saddle, his horse wheeling back in protest. Another shot rang out, this one slamming into the cabin wall inches from where she stood. Arthur's revolver barked twice, and a second rider slumped forward, sliding bonelessly from his mount. The last man spurred his horse forward, closing the distance between them, his rifle raised. Abigail didn't think. She took aim and pulled the trigger. The shot struck true. The man let out a strangled sound before toppling sideways into the snow, his weapon slipping from his grasp. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Smoke curled from the barrel of Arthur's gun. Abigail exhaled slowly, her hands trembling, the rifle still clutched against her shoulder. The snow around the bodies darkened, steaming in the cold. Arthur moved first, stepping over one of the fallen men, his gaze scanning the tree line, looking for more. None came. He turned to Abigail then, his dark eyes unreadable. "You all right?" She swallowed hard, her heartbeat still hammering in her ears. "Yes." Arthur studied her for a long moment before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. He walked over to one of the bodies, nudging it with the toe of his boot. "They'll come again," he said, quiet but certain. Abigail already knew that. The Dawson gang would not let this lie. She lifted her chin. "Then we'll be ready." Something flickered in Arthur's gaze, something she couldn't quite name. He watched her for another beat before turning away, crouching to retrieve the fallen men's weapons. The cold pressed in around them, but Abigail felt something shift in the space between them. For the first time since this had begun, they were standing side by side. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid. The bodies were buried before nightfall, shallow graves carved into the frozen earth beyond the tree line. The scent of gunpowder still clung to the cabin walls, mingling with the coppery ghost of blood in the snow. Abigail's hands were raw from digging, but she hadn't stopped, not even when her breath came in sharp, pained bursts. She had killed a man today. She had lifted her father's old rifle, taken aim, and pulled the trigger without hesitation. It should have shaken her to the core. Instead, all she felt was certainty. They would have killed her, killed Arthur. She had done what needed to be done. Arthur stood beside her, silent as always, his expression giving nothing away. He had cleaned his revolver with slow, methodical precision after the fight, as if readying himself for what would come next. They both knew this wasn't over. The Dawson gang would not let the killing of their men go unanswered. They had bought themselves time, but little else. The moon rose high, casting silver light over the untouched drifts of snow beyond the clearing. Abigail watched it through the cabin window, her fingers curled around a steaming cup of coffee she barely tasted. Arthur sat across from her at the small wooden table, his chair tilted back slightly, eyes half-lidded but alert. "You ever shot a man before today?" His voice was quiet, rough as old leather. She hesitated, shaking her head. "No." He nodded, like he'd expected that. "You hesitate, you die." You didn't hesitate. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "It doesn't feel real yet." "It will." He set his cup down, the sound muted in the hush of the cabin. "Won't haunt you, though. Not this. Not them." She met his gaze, searching for something in the dark depths of his eyes. "And what does haunt you?" Arthur didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the bottle of whiskey on the table, pouring a slow measure into his cup. A different kind of killing. He took a sip, his gaze drifting to the fire. The kind that makes a man question what he is. Abigail swallowed, feeling the weight in his words. She had heard the stories of Arthur Mason long before she had ever laid eyes on him. Stories of a man who had spilled blood in cold calculation, who had lived and breathed by the barrel of a gun. But those were town stories, spoken by people who had never stood in the snow with their life on the line. A slow unease curled in her gut, but it wasn't fear. Not of him, at least. It was the understanding that she had stepped into something she could never turn away from. The days that followed were filled with preparations. Arthur reinforced the cabin's defenses, setting traps along the tree-line, fortifying the doors. Abigail helped without question, her hands steady as she cut strips of cloth for bandages, refilled ammunition belts, boiled what little food they had left. They didn't speak of what was coming, but the weight of it hung between them, thick as the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It came at dusk. The first shot shattered the quiet, ripping through the side of the cabin like a thunderclap. Abigail dropped low, her pulse hammering as she scrambled for the rifle. Arthur was already moving, his gun drawn, his body a shadow against the firelight. A second shot rang out, this one punching through the window. Glass exploded, scattering across the wooden floor. Arthur cursed under his breath. They got numbers? Abigail crouched beside the table, heart pounding. How many? More than us? He peered through the shattered glass, muscles coiled tight. We ain't staying inside. They'll burn us out. The word sent a bolt of cold through her veins. Arthur turned to her, something like regret flickering in his expression. You ready? She gripped the rifle tighter, nodding once. They moved fast. Arthur kicked the back door open, and they slipped into the trees just as another bullet slammed into the front of the cabin, sending splinters flying. The cold hit Abigail like a slap, but she ignored it, forcing her feet through the deep snow. Shouts echoed through the darkness. Men moving through the woods, their voices sharp with purpose. Arthur pulled her behind a fallen log, his breath misting in the air. He motioned with 2 fingers, 3 men coming from the east, 2 more flanking wide. They were hunting them. Abigail steadied her rifle, pressing the stock into her shoulder. The world narrowed, her breath slowing. The first man stepped into view, his gun raised. She fired. The shot caught him just below the ribs. He let out a strangled cry, collapsing to the ground. Then the night erupted into chaos. Arthur fired twice, dropping one of the flanking men before rolling behind the cover of a tree. Another shot cracked past them, sending bark flying. Abigail ducked low, reloading with shaking fingers. Footsteps crunched closer. A shadow loomed, too close. She turned, bringing the rifle up, too slow. A hand wrenched the barrel away, the man's grip iron-tight. His face was half hidden by the dark, but she saw the gleam of his knife. Arthur's gunshot was deafening. The man jerked back, his body going limp before hitting the snow. Abigail gasped, chest heaving. Arthur grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. Move! They ran, the cold air burning her lungs. Behind them, the last remaining Dawson men hesitated. Their advantage was gone. The prey had turned into predators. Arthur fired one last shot into the night. A warning, then silence. The bodies lay scattered in the snow, crimson staining the untouched white. The forest had gone still again, watching, waiting. Abigail sucked in a breath, her hands trembling. The rifle felt heavier than before. Arthur turned to her, his gaze searching. You hurt? She shook her head. No. He nodded, the firelight from the distant cabin flickering against the sharp planes of his face. They won't come back, she said, though she wasn't sure why she believed it. No, he agreed. They won't. The wind howled through the trees, carrying away the last echoes of violence. Abigail looked at Arthur, then really looked at him. The weight of what they had survived settled between them, a bond forged in blood and snow. She wasn't the same woman who had left Cold Creek. And Arthur Mason wasn't just the outlaw they whispered about in town. They had both been ghosts once, living in the shadows of past sins and losses. But here, in the wilderness, among the bodies of men who had come to bury them, they had found something else. Not salvation, not peace, but a reason to keep going. Arthur exhaled, long and slow. Let's go home. And for the first time, the cabin did not feel like a prison. It felt like something worth defending.
A single gunshot cracked the silence of the prairie. The echo rolled across the open land, swallowed by the vastness, but Clara Van Alden did not dare to look back. The cold night wind tore through her thin dress, whipping strands of loose, honey-colored hair into her eyes as she dug her heels into the flanks of the stolen horse. The mare galloped hard, her breath a ghostly plume against the darkness, hooves pounding against the earth as if fleeing damnation itself. Behind her, the lights of the Blackwell estate burned like a wound against the night. Shadows moved in the distance, riders, pursuers. Her heartbeat hammered in time with the gallop, the weight of her father's betrayal sitting heavy in her chest. He had sold her like livestock to Josiah Blackwell, a man whose reputation was carved from the bones of the weak. She had seen what he did to those who disobeyed him, had felt the bruising grip of his hand when he claimed what he believed was already his. A shiver, colder than the wind, rippled through her. She had not waited to find out what marriage to such a man would mean. The moment they sealed the agreement with whiskey and handshakes, she had climbed through the window of her room and stolen the first horse she could find. But running was not enough. She had to disappear. The land ahead stretched into infinity, rolling hills bathed in silver moonlight, grass whispering secrets to the wind. To the east, the river glimmered in the distance, but to the west, a dense tree-line loomed, a black maw swallowing the land. She hesitated only a moment before turning the horse toward it. If she could lose them in the woods, she might stand a chance. The first arrow of warning came in the form of a jagged rock underfoot. The mare shrieked as her stride faltered, and Clara barely managed to cling to the saddle as the horse stumbled, its breath ragged with exhaustion. Her pursuers were closing in. The unmistakable sound of galloping hooves grew louder, the clinking of spurs, the low murmur of men calling to one another. Desperation made her reckless. She urged the mare forward, plunging into the trees. Low-hanging branches clawed at her dress, tore at her skin, leaving behind ribbons of pain. The ground sloped downward, and she tightened her grip on the reins, guiding the mare into the valley's embrace. The scent of damp earth and moss filled her nostrils. Then something changed. The night deepened, thickening into something heavier than mere darkness. The air grew dense, pressing against her skin as if she had crossed an unseen threshold. The wind died. Even the hooves of her horse made no sound against the earth. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled roots pushing up from the ground like skeletal fingers. The world felt still, waiting, a whisper, soft as a breath, just at the edge of hearing. Clara's grip tightened on the reins. She turned her head sharply, searching, but there was only shadow and moonlight. Her breath quickened. The sound hadn't been wind. It had been words. She swallowed hard, fighting the dread that coiled in her gut. Keep moving. The horse suddenly balked, ears flicking back, nostrils flaring. Something unseen had unsettled her. Clara whispered a soothing word, urging her forward, but the mare snorted, refusing. A new sound reached her then, water, a stream somewhere nearby. If she could follow it, she might find a way through the valley, out of the trees. Swinging her leg over, she dismounted, wincing as her feet sank into the damp earth. The moment she let go of the reins, the horse bolted. A strangled cry caught in Clara's throat as she watched it vanish into the trees. She turned, pulse thrumming in her ears. Alone. The whispering started again. This time it was unmistakable. Not the wind, not the trees. Voices, distant but insistent, rising and falling in a language she did not understand. The air turned thick with the scent of burning sage and something older, something deeper, like the memory of fire long since turned to ash. Her feet refused to move, as if something held her in place. She forced herself to take a step, then another, her breath shallow. The stream glowed faintly ahead, moonlight dancing on its surface. And there, standing at the edge of the water, was a man. He was tall, his figure carved in sharp relief against the pale glow of the night. His dark hair hung loose past his shoulders, a single feather woven into the strands. He wore no coat, only buckskin leggings and a breastplate of bone and beads that gleamed dully in the light. Painted markings adorned his arms and face, shadowing his high cheekbones, giving him the appearance of something caught between this world and another. A warrior. Clara's breath hitched as he turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, the silence shattered. Distant gunfire rang out, sharp and brutal against the night. The pursuers were close, too close. Clara whirled, her heart hammering against her ribs. She turned back to the stranger, words fumbling to her lips, but before she could speak, he stepped forward and gripped her wrist. "Come," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Now." Clara hesitated for only a fraction of a second before instinct took hold. She let him pull her into the shadows of the trees, deeper into the unknown. The journey through the wilderness unfolded in silence. The warrior led her with a sure-footed confidence, his grip steady on her wrist as they moved through the tangled undergrowth. He never once looked back, and Clara, despite the uncertainty gnawing at her, did not resist. She had already seen what waited behind her. Men who would drag her back to a life of quiet suffering. This man, whoever he was her only hope. Dawn's first light broke over the horizon by the time they emerged from the trees. Clara stumbled, blinking against the sudden brilliance, her limbs aching from the night's flight. Before her, the land stretched in endless golden waves, the prairie rolling toward distant hills. Smoke curled from the hidden valley below, where a cluster of lodges stood near a riverbank. The warrior finally released her wrist. "You are safe here." His voice was smooth, measured, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity, as though he were assessing more than her wounds or weariness. Clara took a shaky breath, her gaze drifting to the settlement below. "Where is this?" she asked. "My people's land." His dark eyes studied her, as if waiting to see if she would shrink from the answer. She didn't. Instead, relief flooded her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. She had no illusions that she truly belonged here, but she was farther from Blackwell's reach than she had dared to hope. She nodded, barely able to muster the strength for words. "Thank you." His expression did not change, but something shifted in his stance. He nodded in return, then turned sharply and strode ahead, expecting her to follow. The village stirred with the first movements of morning. Women knelt at the river's edge, washing garments against smooth stones, their laughter carrying over the water. Children ran barefoot through the grass, their voices rising in playful shrieks. The scent of wood smoke and roasting corn filled the air, warm and rich. Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her as she walked behind her silent guide, the people pausing in their morning routines to watch the pale stranger in their midst. Some whispered, others frowned. A group of men stood at the edge of the village, their expressions wary. One stepped forward, a broad-shouldered figure with a hardened face, a jagged scar tracing his cheek. "Chaska," the man said, his tone edged with warning. "Who is this?" Chaska. The name settled in Clara's mind as she turned to glance at her protector. His posture remained unshaken, unreadable. "She was being hunted," Chaska said simply. The scarred man's gaze flickered toward Clara, assessing. His distrust was not hidden. "Then she brings danger with her." Chaska did not argue, but his silence carried weight. The moment stretched between them before the man finally nodded. "White Owl will decide." They led her to one of the largest lodges, where the air was thick with the scent of burning herbs. Inside, an elder sat cross-legged by the fire, his weathered face lined with years of wisdom. His silver hair hung in braids, his dark eyes sharp as a hawk's. Chaska spoke first, explaining Clara's escape in quiet, precise words. White Owl listened without expression, nodding only once when Chaska finished. Then he turned his gaze to Clara. "You carry the scent of something old," he said. Clara stiffened. "I don't." "Not on your skin," the elder interrupted. His voice was not unkind, but there was an unmistakable weight in his words. "On your soul." The fire crackled between them. Clara swallowed, uncertain how to respond. The spirits whisper. White Owl continued, his gaze holding hers. "Did you cross the burial ground?" The memory sent a shudder through her. She had been desperate to escape. She hadn't thought hadn't questioned where her path led. Now, she felt the cold press of unseen fingers trailing her spine. I didn't mean to disturb anything," she said. Intentions matter little to the dead. White Owl's expression remained impassive, but the warning in his voice was unmistakable. A hush fell over the lodge. Then the elder exhaled, slow and measured. "You will rest here. But know this, woman of the white men. What follows you does not sleep." Chaska's eyes flickered toward her, unreadable. She had no response. The days passed in a fragile peace. Clara learned quickly how to tend the fire, how to grind corn, how to move among people who watched her with suspicion. Some were kind, the women offering quiet smiles as they taught her simple tasks. But others, like the warrior named Wakasa, made no effort to hide their resentment. "You do not belong here," he told her one evening, his voice a quiet blade. "Chaska is a fool to think otherwise." She clenched her jaw, but did not answer. He was right. This was not her world. Yet, for the first time in her life, she did not feel like a caged thing waiting for her fate to be decided by men. Chaska, however, remained a mystery. He watched her from a distance, his presence steady but never intrusive. He spoke little but listened when she spoke, his gaze holding a depth she did not yet understand. It was not softness, no, there was nothing soft about him. But there was something else, something unspoken. One night, as the fire burned low, he found her standing at the edge of the village, staring at the stars. "You do not sleep," he said. She did not turn to face him. "Neither do you." A flicker of something like amusement crossed his features. "No." Silence settled between them, comfortable in its weight. Finally, she dared to ask, "Do you believe in curses?" Chaska's gaze did not waver. "I believe that when something is taken, something else must be given in return." Her throat tightened. "And if I took something without knowing?" He exhaled slowly. "Then you must be prepared to pay the price." A chill crawled over her skin. She had run from one horror only to step into another, unseen and patient, waiting to claim its due. Chaska turned to her fully then, his expression unreadable. "You cannot outrun what follows you." The night stretched long and silent around them, and for the first time, Clara feared that perhaps he was right. The warning came not in words but in the sudden hush of the wind. The night had been alive with its gentle whispers, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke across the valley, but now it lay silent, heavy as a held breath. Clara woke with a start, her pulse thrumming against her ribs. The dim embers of the fire cast long, flickering shadows across the lodge, and beyond the high-draped entrance, the world felt unnaturally still. Then the first scream tore through the night. She stumbled to her feet, throwing aside the woven blanket, her breath caught in her throat. A second scream followed, this one closer, raw with terror. She barely had time to react before the lodge flap burst open, and a young boy, no older than 10, tumbled inside, his face streaked with sweat and ash. "They're coming," he choked out. Chaska was already awake. He moved past her, grabbing his bow and quiver, his expression dark, unreadable. Outside, the village had erupted into chaos. Figures moved wildly in the torchlight, warriors shouting orders, women rushing to gather children, elders gripping medicine bundles with trembling hands. Clara's stomach twisted at the sight of fire licking at the edges of the lodges, smoke curling into the starless sky. Then she saw them, riders, pouring over the ridge like a flood, silhouetted against the moon. Their torches bobbed in the night, casting an eerie, flickering glow upon their twisted grins and the gleaming steel of their weapons. At their head, a familiar figure loomed, Josiah Blackwell. His long coat flared behind him as he reined his horse sharply, surveying the village with cold amusement. Clara's blood turned to ice. He had found her. She stumbled backward, but Chaska caught her arm, his grip firm. "Go," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Find White Owl. Stay with him. I can't just—" "Go," he repeated, pushing her toward the cluster of lodges where the elders had gathered. A gunshot cracked through the air. A Lakota warrior crumpled beside them, his body twisting as he fell. The spell of paralysis shattered, and the village erupted into movement. Chaska sprinted toward the fight, vanishing into the shadows between the lodges. Clara's legs refused to obey at first. Her breath came in short, panic gasps as she turned, feet stumbling across the dirt. She barely made it past the first row of lodges before a rough hand yanked her back, twisting her arm behind her. A cry of pain tore from her lips. Well, Blackwell drawled, his breath warm against her ear. I knew you'd run yourself into a corner eventually. She fought, kicking, clawing, but his grip only tightened. He dragged her toward his horse, the heat of his fury barely restrained beneath his polished, calculating exterior. You think you belong here, do you? He sneered. Among these savages? You think they keep you? He yanked her forward, fingers bruising her wrist. You're mine, Clara. You were promised. Let her go. The voice was steady, cutting through the night like a blade. Chaska stood a few paces away, his bow drawn, an arrow nocked and aimed at Blackwell's heart. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something dark, something lethal. Blackwell chuckled, unbothered. You really think you can stop me, boy? He yanked Clara against him, pressing the barrel of his revolver to her temple. You shoot, she dies. Chaska's fingers did not waver. You will die first? For a moment, the world held its breath. The only sound was the crackle of burning lodges, the distant cries of battle. Clara felt the press of cold steel against her skin, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then the wind shifted. It did not come as a gentle breeze, but as a sudden, biting force that curled through the village, sending flames sputtering, twisting the smoke into grotesque shapes. A sound rose with it, not a howl, not a whistle, but a whisper, low at first, then building. The ground beneath them trembled. The riders' horses screamed, rearing back, eyes rolling white with terror. Warriors on both sides hesitated, glancing wildly around as the whispers grew louder, surrounding them, filling every empty space with their insidious murmur. The air turned thick, pressing against Clara's skin, suffocating. And then the dead came. They emerged from the darkness beyond the ridge, their forms shifting like smoke, hollow eyes burning like embers in the night. Some rode upon spectral horses, their skeletal faces frozen in expressions of rage, of sorrow, of unrelenting vengeance. Others walked, dragging weapons rusted with the stain of old blood. Blackwell's men panicked. One bolted outright, his scream lost in the wind. Another tried to fire, but his hands shook too violently to aim. The whispers grew deafening now, words forming among them, harsh, guttural, ancient. Clara could not move. The burial ground. She had crossed it. She had disturbed them. And now they had come for blood. Blackwell snarled, snapping out of his stupor. Tricks, he spat, shoving Clara aside. He raised his gun toward Chaska, but before he could fire, the first revenant reached them. It did not attack with weapons, but with the sheer force of its presence. Blackwell's body jerked violently, his eyes going wide with terror. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The color drained from his face, his skin turning pale, then gray. His fingers convulsed around the gun before it slipped from his grasp, landing uselessly in the dirt. He staggered back, choking on nothing, his body writhing against an unseen force. The whispers swarmed him, thick as smoke, curling around his limbs like chains. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. Blackwell collapsed. His body lay motionless, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. His lips parted slightly, as if he had been trying to scream when the life was stolen from him. And then, before Clara's eyes, his body began to sink. The earth swallowed him whole, pulling him into the darkness beneath, as if he had never been there at all. Silence fell. The revenants turned, their burning gazes sweeping across the battlefield. Their forms flickered, shifting between the world of the living and the dead. And then, one by one, they began to fade. The whispers receded, drawn back into whatever place they had been called from. The wind died. The battle was over. Chaska lowered his bow. His face, always so unreadable, now held something new, something wary. He turned to Clara, his voice quiet. They took their vengeance. She stared at the place where Blackwell had stood, her body trembling. "It was because of me," she whispered. He did not argue. Instead, he stepped toward her, gently touching her shoulder. "Come," he said. "It is finished." But in her heart, she knew it was not. The night had not yet released its grip on the land. Though the revenants had vanished, their presence clung to the village like the last breath of a dying fire. Smoke curled from the charred remains of lodges, the scent of ash and blood thick in the air. The silence that followed was heavier than the battle itself. Not a peace, but a weight, a thing that pressed down upon the survivors, waiting to see who would rise from the ruin and who would crumble beneath it. Clara stood at the edge of the village, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her breath came in shallow, uneven pulls, her gaze locked on the spot where the earth had swallowed Josiah Blackwell whole. He was gone, but she could still hear the echoes of his screams, still feel the cold press of his fingers bruising her wrist. She should have felt relief. Instead, a terrible, gnawing emptiness spread inside her. Chaska emerged from the remnants of battle, his steps measured, his bow still clutched in his hand. His face, streaked with sweat and dirt, was unreadable. He had fought to protect his people, to protect her. And yet, as he looked at her now, there was something else in his gaze. "They will not come back," he said. It was not a question. Clara forced herself to nod. No, the words felt too simple, too small for what had transpired. The spirits had claimed what was owed to them. The dead had risen, not for her, not for Chaska, but for vengeance. And in doing so, they had left something behind, a wound in the land, a scar upon the night. A rustling in the wind made her shudder. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the burial ground lay untouched once more, yet she could still feel the weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting. She had disturbed something that would never forget her. "You are afraid," Chaska observed. She swallowed hard. "Aren't you?" He considered her for a moment, then finally nodded. "I know what it means to awaken the restless." A gust of wind swept through the valley, kicking up dust and embers. The whispers were gone, but the memory of them lingered in the hollow space between heartbeats. Clara turned away from the battlefield, away from the smoldering remains of Blackwell's men, their bodies abandoned to the night. She could not bear to look at them any longer. "What happens now?" Chaska hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "You should leave." The words hit harder than she expected. She spun to face him, confusion flashing through her. "What?" His dark eyes met hers, steady, unreadable. "You do not belong here, Clara. Whatever follows you, it is not finished." She shook her head. "I don't understand." But she did. Deep down, she knew what he meant. The spirits had taken their vengeance, but their hunger was not sated. She had walked too close to the line between the living and the dead, and something had reached out for her. Chaska stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "I cannot protect you from what you have stirred." Clara clenched her fists. "You don't have to." Emotion flickered behind his gaze, a war he fought within himself. She had seen it before, the push and pull of duty, of fear, of something unspoken between them that neither had dared to name. He had saved her, had fought for her, and in doing so, had bound himself to her in ways he might never admit. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you want me to leave?" He didn't answer, but his silence spoke louder than words. She reached for his hand before she could stop herself. His skin was warm, rough with the calluses of a warrior, but he did not pull away. The firelight danced across his face, casting deep shadows beneath his cheekbones. His lips pressed into a tight line. "Chaska," she murmured, her fingers tightening around his. Finally he spoke. "If you stay, you will never be free." She swallowed against the lump in her throat. "And if I go?" His gaze darkened, something unreadable flickering through his eyes. "Then neither will I." The truth settled between them, heavy as the night itself. A sudden cry from the far side of the village broke the moment. Chaska stiffened, his head snapping toward the sound. Clara turned with him, her pulse quickening. A group of warriors had gathered near the edge of the lodges, their voices sharp, urgent. One of them stepped forward, face pale beneath streaks of war paint. "The land is wrong." Clara felt her breath hitch. The warrior gestured toward the hills beyond the village. The earth is split. Chaska's grip on her hand tightened. Without a word, he led her toward the disturbance, the unease in his posture coiling like a snake ready to strike. They climbed the ridge, the night stretching wide before them. And then Clara saw it. The ground had cracked open, a jagged wound slicing through the valley floor. But it was not just a simple rift in the earth. The soil was dark, blackened, pulsing as if it breathed. The wind that rushed from it was not cold, not hot, but wrong. She stepped closer, her chest tightening. Something stirred in the darkness below, something unseen but waiting. The spirits had taken their vengeance, but the land itself had taken something else. Chaska exhaled slowly. It is not over. Clara met his gaze, a shiver running through her. No, it was just beginning.